Didn't want that to be like beautified in there, did you? Beautified.
I don't know what we would do to do, stamp it.
Flat, you know, I mean. You want to slip a ball on there.
No. I'm just tired, so. No, straight. Grace and my dad Matthew came back. No, we're done. Thank you.
Go off on this. Sure.
Yeah, what if you want?
You enjoyed it? Things are getting manageable now.
It's getting manageable now?
Yeah. Okay, it's late in the season.
Well, I've been able to get a lot of work done this fall.
Yeah. I know.
Yeah.
Done well.
How are you doing?
Doing fine. See
Kind of weird to be here in the daylight.
I know, it's great.
Pretty much it right now.
Days are getting short. Barely squeak out an 8-hour day, bro.
I actually went and bought a power plant, so I've been around the legs. Got a trailer that's got 4 lights on it, or go up. I mean, it'll light up this whole. So I got tired after hauling the storage units out of San Antonio. We were running phone spent at 5:36 in the morning. Our headlights, Skipster lights, LED. Got a good deal on the used ones.
Okay, I'll let you know. That's why I got called out. If you see it, that's good. Yeah.
This is more important.
Jeff James. No. She better take one of those personal. And she get excited. Trust me, I know. Trust me, I know.
It's really a broader discussion. Oh, yeah.
Stuff that I can,
You know. Is my wing on straight?
Smile.
Or you gotta zoom in on those.
I was gonna say, you missed a spot back there. Good thing I'm not right there.
Ankle surgery.
Ankle.
They have it replaced or?
He said they had to go and re-break it.
That's right.
I'm pretty sure that's what he said.
See why he doesn't want to be here.
All right, clock shows noon. Let's call this meeting to order. All rise for the Sooners fight song, for the Pledge of Allegiance.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
All right, John Leo. Here. Matt Bugera.
Here.
Nancy Rondell.
Here.
John Cox. I don't think it is absent, but we do have a quorum.
Excellent. Do you have any citizens' comment today for anything that's not on the agenda? One. There we go.
You know why we're getting 2 electric bills this month?
Talk to that guy.
No particular reason. There was a glitch in the software. We've got 2 calls in the last 15
Okay,
minutes.
yep.
So disregard one.
I just got mine and
Pay the higher
other
one.
people I heard from also got,
Well, they should, they're all identical,
yeah,
but there's just 2.
okay.
So we've already got it fixed, but if you feel like it, you can go ahead and pay both.
Oh, okay.
Pay ahead.
Yeah, take forward. All right, moving on the computer for public comment.
We have 1 in attendance.
Yeah. All right. Guess we can move on to the consent agenda. Things stand out that we need to discuss?
I didn't see anything.
I read the minutes, they seem fine to me, so.
Make a motion to approve.
Second.
Public comment on the consent agenda.
And a second by Nancy. Matt Bugera,
Yes.
John Leo,
Yes.
John Cobbs, yes, and Nancy Rondell.
Yes.
Motion carried.
City manager section.
Great. Okay, so the first item on the agenda here is we have Mark Beauchamp from, is that how you pronounce it, Beauchamp?
Yep.
From Utility Financial Solutions to present on an electric rate study. So this kind of coincides with an electric system study that we had approved to do for this year, and which that's near completion. We have a draft of that, which includes several of the projects that are anticipated in the next 6 to 10 years. As you know, our rates have not been raised in at least 15 years. We haven't done a rate study probably longer than that. Same thing with our system study. We didn't do one, probably it's been at least 15 years since we did an electric system study. So these kind of make sense to do these together because the outcome of that system study determines, what kind of rates we might need to look at going forward in electric utility side of things. So we probably, to put some context to discussion, we do have a lot of utility projects in the electric system coming up and a lot of high dollar projects. And I just put that in the back of your mind as we go through this rate study and rate presentation from Mark as to why there's a need for increase, which is also because we haven't had a steady increase in 15 years as well. So we have to look for the fact that we've not increased in the past. And we also have these other projects that we can do that we need to save money for or spend money on. So I think it's really important to remember that this is just a preliminary study and it's up to the council to decide how we want to go forward with the rates. But Utility Financial Solutions have been doing these electric rate studies and other utility system studies for many municipalities in the area in the state. So we've been working well with them and I think they've done a good job. They really know their stuff. So I'll hand it over to Mark to do a presentation on the rate study.
Good, well, thank you. I appreciate the opportunity to be here. I'll tell you a little bit about our company before I get going on the results. Utility Financial Solutions was started in 2001. I've been working with electric rates for a little over 40 years. I actually started with the Holland Board of Public Works. And Utility Financial Solutions teaches the cost of service courses for the American Public Power Association, as well as municipal financial planning courses for them, APPA and AWWA and American Gas Association. We've done cost of service work for 44 states, including the islands of Guam, the Caribbean, Barbados, Bermuda. And we probably do in excess of a little over 100 studies annually, electric studies. So what I'm here to talk about is the results of, there's 3 phases that are part of the cost of service study. One is the long-term financial projection, which identifies how your financials are going to look over the next 5 years. Actually, our models go up 20 years. And then the second part of it is to look at how much it costs to provide service to each class and what the different rate components should consist of. After those 2 parts are completed, before we do the third part, which is the rate design, we stop to get input from the governing body because we want your input on, do you agree with our financial projection? Because financial plans, financial projections built on a lot of assumptions. And with our rate track that we're proposing, do you agree with that? And then we look at the cost of service study. And the cost of service study is going to show you how much it costs to provide service to each class of customers and how much revenue you're going to get to show which classes should go up more than others. So we want to get your input and how should we move the classes closer to cost of service for fairness purposes. All right. And after we get that input, we then go back and design the rates, all right, for subsequent approval. So with that, if you want to go through, as I mentioned, we're going to be doing the financial projection and the cost of service study. I'm going to be reviewing those results and asking you for input on the rate design. So the next slide will work. Now, one of the key things when you build a financial projection is the assumptions you make. And we have the historical data as far as revenues and expenses. And then we have to forecast them out over the next 20 years, basically. And we build it on certain assumptions, like inflation, for example. We're using 2.2%, which is the historical norm for the past 10 years. Now, obviously, in the last year, we've seen those inflation rates. Right now, it's averaging 5.4. But for purposes of the assumption, we're using 2.2. Now, I will say this. In electric, inflation has only a modest impact on our results. Water and wastewater is a different situation because electricity costs about 70–80% of your costs is in the power supply. So labor, material, supplies is a relatively low percentage of your total cost. So inflation doesn't have a big impact, but we did assume 2.2. We assumed a growth rate of 0.5%, so modest growth rate. We looked at the purchase power change in purchase power costs, about 3% annually. And then the big thing, actually, want to go to the next slide before I get into the bond issuances. One of the key things that's driving our recommendations, as Victor mentioned, is a capital improvement plan. Right now, when we look from a financial standpoint at your electric department, you're relatively financially stable. You have good cash reserves. Look, your operating income is projected negative, but the age of your infrastructure is about 50% depreciated, which means that you're right in average. You're not a system that's older or a system that's newer. So financially, you're very stable. It doesn't mean we don't need to tweak rates upward, but right now you're in a very good position. Now, with that said, when we look at your capital improvement plan, focus on this bottom line. Between 2022 and 2025, we're looking at about $900 to $1 million a year in capital. What we're planning for is what's currently projected in 2026, where we're looking at about a $4.6 million expenditure most of that's due to the new substation, the $2.7 million. Well, we have certain options. If we were to not do anything with rates and then wait for that point in time, we're setting ourselves up for a huge rate increase on our customers. As a general rule of thumb, what we've known in our 20 years of history is that we have rate increases of less than 5% a year. Customers tend to view them as inflationary type rate adjustments. Get very little backlash from the community. They tend to be acceptable. Increases between 5 and 10%, they're still acceptable, but you get backlash from large users. Always try to avoid double-digit rate increases, especially with electric. Water and wastewater, maybe a little more lenient on, but electric, always try to avoid double-digit. So what we try to do when we see this is to start to prepare the utility financially so that we minimize the rate impacts on customers as much as possible. And that's primarily what we're going to be looking at today, because that's probably the biggest thing and the biggest key to our next step is that rate track, because we want to design rates for the next 3 years. All right. The reason I say 3 years, even though we do a 5, you're going to see a 5-6 year forecast, is when you do a financial projection with these assumptions that we're using, we've noticed historically that we're usually very close in years 1, 2, and 3. When you start looking in years 4 and 5, there's only one thing I'm certain of, and that is we're going to be wrong because it's built on so many assumptions. Some will materialize and some won't. So we prefer that prior to the 4th year that this projection gets reviewed again and updated. That's the reason why we try to focus on 3 years with the rate adjustments at one time. So if you want to go to the next slide. Now, this is a summary without any rate adjustments of your financial position. I'm going to get into the key targets we look at. The first one is your cash reserves. We recommend at a minimum that you maintain at least 1.2 million in cash at a minimum. And I'll go through how we determine that. And in 2022, without any rate changes, you're above that, 2.6 million. But when you look at historically, what's going to happen in the future is in 2024, you dropped about $500,000. We have a bond issuance coming in here. That's why you see that jumping up. But in 2026, our cash balances are projected to go negative. Oh, that's one of the things too, that capital plan for 2026, we're projecting that you're going to need about $6 million in debt issuance. So I just want to give you a heads up on that too, to help fund that, to try to smooth it out for your customers. The second target we look at is your target operating income, which we're looking at about $200,000 a year. You're looking at operating losses each year. Now I'll get into what that target operating income represents. It's a little bit different way of looking at your financials. It's more of how an accountant would look at it. Then we have coverage ratios. Whenever you issue debt, you don't have any debt currently, so it's not an issue for you. But we're looking at debt to fund these capital plans you have. When you issue debt for an electric utility, usually it's what's called revenue bonds. It's different than general obligation bonds. General obligation bonds are secured by the property taxes of the community. All right, and so there's no bond covenant requirements for that. With revenue bonds, it's different. Those are secured by the revenues of the electric department. And so you have to go out and get a bond rating. And then you have a bond ordinance. And then within that bond ordinance, there's covenant requirements. The traditional bond covenant requirement is a 1.25 coverage. And what that means is that when you have to generate 25% more in cash through your operations than what your debt service payment is. If you fall below that, you're in technical default of debt. So we're looking at your debt coverage ratio. Well, now remember, we get that $6 million debt that we're planning on. You see your coverage ratio is at 0.28. It should be at least a 1.4, in our opinion. Minimum is 1.4. So we can see that we definitely have an issue when we start getting out in 25 and 26. So what I'm going to be asking the council for is to prepare us for that with some modest adjustments now to minimize those impacts that are going to happen in 4 or 5 years from now. So go ahead. I'm going to get into some of the details. I talked about debt coverage ratio. I just want to show you how it's calculated. I mentioned that we look at the cash that's generated from operations divided by your debt service payment. So it's a very simple calculation. You can see that in 2025. The cash generated from operations is 137,000, that's projected. The debt service payment is 481. So you see the coverage ratio is 0.28. The minimum is 1.4. So really that number should be closer to at least $700,000, right? So I'll go to the next target. The next target is going to take a little bit more explanation. It's minimum cash reserves. And when we look at how much cash a utility needs to maintain in reserves, we look at what's called working capital needs, which is a timing difference between when you pay a bill and get the money from customers. For example, you go all through the month of January paying for labor, materials, supplies. Let's say a one billing cycle. At the end of the month of January, you read all the meters. The first week of February, you send out the bills. You don't get that money till March. So there's a timing difference between when you pay the bill and when you get the money from customers. Any utility that bills monthly, that working capital lag is about 45 days. So we want to make sure that that working capital lag is within your reserves at all times to ensure you pay your bills in a timely fashion. So that would be part of your O&M expense, your purchase power. I'm going to skip over this line for a moment and go to this bottom one, capital improvements. The other part of cash reserves you want to make sure is there is that when you have capital improvements that are funded by internal cash reserves, that you have cash to both start and complete the capital improvement projects for that year. So we want to make sure that at the beginning of the construction season, if it's $1 million of capital that's planned to be expended, that you have that money in your cash reserves. All right. Now, then there's the historical rate base. There's also unexpected events, catastrophic events that occur that can you have a transformer blowing up. You could have an ice storm, a windstorm. If you're in Florida, it could be a hurricane. Well, what we want to make sure happens is that you have enough cash in reserves, not to fund an entire catastrophic event, because that can be a lot of money, but enough cash in your reserves to start the repair and replacement process until financing can be arranged. So how we determine that, or how we look at it, we look at the age of your infrastructure. So we feel that if you have a newer infrastructure, you have less exposure to a catastrophic event. If you have an older infrastructure, you have more exposure to bad things happening, like a transformer failure. And in your case, you're right at the average, at 50%. So we consider Harbor Springs to be at an average risk factor for a catastrophic event compared to other utilities. So what we do is we look at your historical investment in assets, and we assume, it's relatively arbitrary, but it's an assumption that we use, that 2% of your historical investment in assets should be held in your reserves to protect the customers and protect the utility against a catastrophic event. So we look at all this, and we call this our basic formula. There's other factors for other utilities that we use. Like if it's a utility that has one large customer that represents 50% of their sales, we're going to consider that a higher risk and bring additional factors. So we can kind of consider Harbor Springs to be a low risk area or environment. So the basic risk formula or cash reserve formula we feel is adequate. So we did the calculations, it comes out to about 1.2 million. That's a minimum, not a target. So we want to see cash reserves above that level. All right. Now, when we look at your current cash balances without any rate changes, you can see that you're exceeding those levels until 2024. We dropped down to 515,000. And then in 2025, we have a $6 million bond issuance coming in. And so the cash reserve goes up to 5 million, but then in 2026, it drops negative. So, do I go to the next target? Now, this third target is a little bit different. Now, the first two targets are what we call cash basis targets. Any utility operates on a cash basis. They're going to look at their cash needs. They're going to look at their debt coverage ratio. We add a third, and that's called target operating income. Now, the reason we do this is when we look at doing a financial projection, setting a rate track is not an exact science. So what we do is we look at what are the minimum factors? Where do we have to maintain? We have to keep cash above a certain minimum. We have to meet our coverage ratio. So we have to set rates high enough to exceed those minimums. The upper boundary is this target operating income. So the reason we do that is we then have a range that we're trying to reach when we establish the rate track. Now, this target operating income, what it looks at is it's more, as I mentioned earlier, how an accountant would look at your financials. They look at depreciation expense, fully funding depreciation expense. So that if you put $1 million asset in service with a 20-year life, every year there's theoretically $50,000 of wear and tear on that infrastructure. So at the end of 20 years, if you funded the depreciation, you're going to have $1 million to replace that asset, but it's going to cost you more than $1 million. Because every year the replacement cost of the asset increases. So the target operating income is the inflationary increase in the asset's replacement cost. Now that's about $200,000 a year. It increases to $400,000 over the term of the projection. And you can see that you're looking at operating losses each year, starting at $12,000 of operating losses, increasing to $300,000. So what we're going to try to do now is to set a rate track that balances all these targets together. So if you look over here, this is our projected rate track that we're proposing, which we're looking at 3 years worth of rate adjustments right now at 2.5%. Then right now in 25 and 26, if the assumptions we made hold true, we're looking at possibly 4.9% adjustments. Now, with this rate track, if you look at your cash reserves, you stay above the minimum cash reserve levels in each year. In 2026, we're falling slightly below it. In 2027, we're back above it. But it's a relatively modest difference. Debt coverage ratio, remember they were 0.28 earlier. You see our debt coverage ratio is at 1.55. The minimum is 1.4. We're going up to 2.33. So we're actually above our minimum coverage of 1.4. Our adjusted operating income, this is our targets. This is what our adjusted operating income is running at. So with this rate track in 2022, we were at a negative 13,000, I think. Now we're at a positive 94, and a positive 175, positive 231. You see at the end of the 3-year period, we're very close to this upper boundary, the target operating income. Now, after that point, I would recommend that these get reviewed prior to the implementation of those rate adjustments. So my very first question to the council is, in many ways, the most important one, is do you agree with our rate track? Do you feel comfortable with our rate track? Like I said, as a general rule, we try to keep the adjustments less than 5% if we can. And that's kind of how we developed this rate track. Is there any questions or concerns, any questions about the targets?
I have just a quick question. Why, not that I want the rates to go up more, but instead of 2.5, why don't you do 3 for 3 years so that we don't have to jump to 4.9?
Have a shallower ramp.
That is definitely something we can easily do. And that would limit, because if we did those 3% in the first 3 years, those 4.9% are probably going to drop to about 4%, or maybe 3.5%.
Right.
Yeah.
Wondered
Yeah, I
what the
had the
thinking
same-
was,
I had the
yeah,
same
that
question.
there was so much.
No, I think that's a really good suggestion.
I mean, as far as whether we agree or not, this is all new. I mean, I couldn't agree or disagree. This is one more facet where council gets educated. I mean, I speak for myself. It's gonna take a little more thought to be able to say, yeah, I agree or not. I mean, as you go through the presentation, I'm sure we're coming up with questions. It seems like a very logical process, and this is something that you've done dozens of times before, so there's some logic behind it.
Yeah. Now, we got your water wastewater study too, so we're looking at these same things again. So if council's okay, what we'll do is we'll go back to design rates to achieve a 3% adjustment.
I mean, are we at question time, or did more you were gonna go over before we open up for questions?
I'm gonna go further into the cost of service study. We can come back to this. Now,
We have
you go to the next
cost, it's
slide.
gonna be about
Now, the cost of service study.
$400 a year.
What a cost of service study does is it takes the theoretical revenue requirements out of the financial projection. That's that target operating income. It says, all right, who's causing those costs? In other words, if the system peaks at 6 o'clock in the evening on July 22nd, and we're paying demand costs for that from a power provider, who's using power at that time? So we have load research that we go into to identify what the usage patterns are of the different customers and the different customer classes. And we say, okay, the residential class is using this amount at 6 o'clock in the evening on July 22nd. And we do that for every month of the year, by the way. But and then it allocates the cost to the different users based on who's using the energy at different times. Okay. So when we did that, now to meet that target operating income, we need a 4.6%. This is the theoretical. Now, electric residential insight shows a need for 13.5%. Obviously, we're not proposing a 13.5% adjustment. But it's what I'm going to be asking you next is, let's say we do the 2.5 or the 3%. It's how much leeway or bandwidth around that percentage that you'll allow me to move the classes closer to cost of service. Let me give you an example of that. Let's say you give me a bandwidth of 2%. What that means is with a 3% increase, no customer class would see an increase greater than 5%. And all customer classes would see at least a 1%. So I work within that range to design the rates. Okay. So residential shows the need for a 13.5%. So just without running the numbers, I would say that if you want the 3% adjustment, residentials would probably see something close to 4%. Just to give you an idea. That's inside. Now, outside the city, 4.9%. The annual electric, 14.5%. Look at some of the bigger classes like electric demand inside and outside city. They show 6% and 4%, which is really almost right at the average. So they would get the average increase. So then you have the city charges. The bigger increases are the city. The city's rates are slightly discounted, so they show the need for bigger adjustments. Now, obviously, we would give them that upper boundary adjustment of probably 5%. So the city's pulp, for example, will go up 5%. Okay. So I'll go to the next slide. The reason we pull this out specifically is probably the most misunderstood charge in utilities, be it electric, water, wastewater, is that monthly facilities charge or customer charge. And if you look at like residential, you're currently charging $4. Cost of service day says should be $12.50. What that charge represents is when a customer has a meter installed on their home, The utility had to install that meter. They also have the responsibility to repair it, to replace the meter when it needs to be replaced. Every month they have to read the meter. They have to send the customer the bill. And they also have a service drop going from the main line into the home. Those are fixed costs that do not vary based on consumption. All right, so even if there's no electricity being used, those costs still exist. All right, so those get rolled into this fixed monthly customer charge. There's no question that the parts that I just said should be in the customer charge. Where the controversy comes in with the customer charge is we have to have a wire that runs from the substation to the home. Without that wire, we cannot deliver electricity. Then the question becomes how much of that wire should be recovered through the customer charge and how much of the usage component. Well, when we do a cost of service, we do a standard methodology, which is called a minimum system analysis. We look at what is the minimum, the cost to install the minimum size wiring to every facility in Harbor Springs. That amount gets rolled into the customer charge. So in a sense, think about it this way. How much does it cost to build a distribution infrastructure where every customer uses 1 kilowatt hour? Right. That cost gets rolled into the customer charge. Obviously, customers don't use 1 kilowatt hour, they use more. So that causes the infrastructure to be larger than that minimum sizing. That amount gets put into the usage component, right? So, and where this becomes an issue is the arguments against it is first of all, from an environmental standpoint. You know, a lot of environmentalists, they don't like this charge because when you put something into a fixed charge, you're lowering the volumetric charge. So you're not sending as strong of a price signal to consumers. So that's from an environmental standpoint. Now, but then there's a fairness standpoint also. The fairness standpoint is this, it's definitely applicable to Harbor Springs, is when you have a seasonal customers and you don't charge the proper customer charge to them, the seasonal customers are getting subsidized by the year-round ratepayers because we have to charge higher in the volumetric side, which the year-round ratepayers are using more annually, volumetrically, than seasonal customers every 3 months. So the year-round ratepayers are subsequently subsidizing the seasonal customers. So that when we don't set that customer charge at the appropriate levels, all right? So now this all rolls into the overall rate adjustment. So if we increase the customer charge, it's going to lower the volumetric, all right? But overall, we're going to get X percent. So my question to council is this. Normally, when we adjust rates, we ask for bandwidth in a sense, or the ability to increase this. And I would propose a $2 increase each year in that customer charge for residential. So I'll go from $4 to $6, $8, $10. Now I want to show you the next slide. Now, a couple of things. Now we do work all over the country. We've literally done probably 2,000 electric studies around the United States. And your customer charge of $12.50 for residential from a cost of service standpoint is one of the lower ones we've seen. The average is probably between 16 and 22. So that tells me that you're definitely doing something right with your infrastructure or your operations because that customer charge is lower. Now, Charlevoix is at $8.75. Right, Traverse City's at $9 and Petoskey's at $12.45. You're at $4. Now, even the numbers that I see here are lower than most utilities are because there's been so many changes in our infrastructure. Our whole industry is changing and moving to renewables and solar, for example. And again, if we don't send the proper rates, we create subsidies. If our price signals are not right, some customers take advantage of those the lack of our price signals, and they're actually subsidized by others. And solar is a good indication of that. You know, solar is a great thing to put resource on your home. But when we price it based upon our retail rates, for example, we have distribution infrastructure that, they're generating electricity, but they're still using our distribution infrastructure that we're not recovering. So, and part of that is that customer charge. So what's happened over the last 10 years is utilities around the country have increased that customer charge for a lot of reasons. One is fairness, but also as an offset to the loss or the cross subsidization that occurs when customers install solar. Now, I don't think Michigan's ever going to be a hotspot for solar, I'll be honest with you. We have some of the lowest solar generate, it's just not a good place to put solar. I remember I worked for Holland back in 1992. We wanted to be one of the first utilities to install solar. So I hired a consulting firm to come in. And consulting firms came and said, you know what, you're the worst place in the country to install solar, even worse than Seattle. So it's not going to be, the capacity factors are around 12%. Where nationwide, they're usually around 18 to 20%. When I say capacity factor, it's how much it's generating. They're just not good in Michigan. Doesn't mean they're not going to be installed, and some people will, but it's not going to be as big as you're going to see in other parts of the United States. But nonetheless, just from a fairness standpoint, we should increase that customer charge and get things in line from a fairness standpoint. So my question to you is, do you agree that we should increase that at $2 a year?
Sounds reasonable.
I mean, it's a nominal, based on your model, it's the right thing to do. And it's $2 a year, kind of in the noise level.
Oh, is it? It's not $2 a year, it's $2 a month.
$2
a month.
Yeah, but
Oh,
each year it
$2 a
goes
month.
up $2. So it'd be
Got
okay.
it.
4 to
Well,
6.
still,
to 8.
24 for a year, yeah.
So the price of a cup of Starbucks coffee is sometimes what they look at.
I don't want to minimize the effect that it could have on some of the residents.
Well,
And particularly if it's year after year, you say, well, it's not a whole lot, but after 3 years, it's adding up. So as we make these decisions, if we need to do it to keep the system whole and healthy, that's one thing, but let's not ignore the cumulative impact that it's going to have on residents.
correct, yeah. I think, is that the last slide? Yes, it is. What I'm going to do, if we go back to the financial projection. This one. Now, one of the things that was proposed is 3% for the next 3 years. And what I can do is two things, basically. Design the rates for 3%. And I revise this slide to show you what it's going to do to 25 to 26. I feel it's probably going to bring it closer to 3.5 to 4, but in those years, in the projection. But there's a lot of things unknown with the capital plan right now. So it's possible that could come down or even give us more leeway to go closer to 5 if something adverse happened. So, but we'll go ahead and design the rates for 3%. I'll design, redesign or update this financial projection with those numbers.
I'll clarify, if I just add on to that, we're going to be seeing the capital improvements plan here in early December. So we won't bring out the rates, the finalized rate, until after you guys have a chance to weigh in on the capital improvements plans, see some of the projects that we need to do with our electric system.
If anything substantially changes, we come back.
There's that model right there with my properties. It cost me about $250 a year.
$250 a year.
2.5%, John?
Figure the 5% between my commercial property, residential.
Right.
So it's not huge. Manageable.
I think, just say that the average charge is $100 a month, probably fairly close. That'd be $2.50 a month total. The average residential is.
Now, this model was designed around a $6 million project,
Yes.
Well, it's designed a $6 million bond.
$6 million bond, and the bond is to fund a
The new
A
substation.
new substation, and the new substation, not a replacement, not an upgrade, but a new one that is required because of,
Well, we'll get to that, but then we'll get to that in our capital.
well, I mean,
improvements
just,
plan.
we're looking at a model and we're
So
looking at rate
basically-
increases and we're looking at a bond, but I'm not sure what it is that we're
Our
bonding or.
new, so the new substation is, our current substation is on the far eastern edge of the city limits.
Okay.
And so it is not in the center of the load. And when we have summer season, when we have huge amount of load on our system, the likelihood of brownouts happening drastically increases in blowing transformers because of the amount of load, because it's not in the center of the system.
I get that.
I don't know, Dan, if you want to expand on that.
Yeah,
something
that's
else.
basically what it is. It's just a certain time of the year when everybody's here, obviously. It's at its max. I mean, you got your regulators, all of it, more, those few months. And you could have.
And this was actually recommended back in 2006 to the city to get a new substation, but
I think when this substation out by Hathaway, out by the sewer authority was originally put in, and correct me if I'm wrong, they kind of thought with our system going as far as it does over towards the brewery, for instance, that way, that would be more the epicenter of usage in that, but it never developed.
And it turns out it's not the case.
Right.
So
So
that was always thought to be our commercial. I mean, Little Traverse Township is our commercial district.
Right.
and it never here
but
factories
our
and
load,
stuff
but our
like
load
that
is
never
still the
developed.
residential. It's still the residential, is seasonal residential.
Well, the homes around here are getting small, that's the problem.
And we know, as Dan's been saying, like, a lot of houses now are asking for 600 amp
Oh, yeah,
services.
the average is 400 amp service.
Yeah.
Well, you gotta figure electric cars.
Well, that's.
Cars a new thing. All the homes I'm building right now, they're all putting electric services in. So that draws,
80 amps per.
exactly. So I mean, taking 200 amp service, everybody's gonna jump them up if they're gonna increase the electric cars. So that's gonna bring our load way up.
And so the new substation that's being proposed, it originally was located here. We had a substation here near City Hall. It was moved back to, or it's moved to the eastern end. So that is going to be presented to council with our capital improvements plan. We have a system study by GRP Engineering. They've listed out all the projects in the next 6 to 7 years and prioritize them. With that also comes replacing the transformer at the existing substation, because that needs to be replaced as well. So
Yeah.
that's also $1 million plus project.
That's not part of this.
It's part of the rate study, it's included, but it's not part of the bond. The bond is for the $6 million is for the new substation as well as the distribution line. But the replacement of the transformer at the substation has been included in this rate proposal study.
If you go back a couple slides. Here's the one before that. There we go. This is the capital plan. So, you have this, the 2.7 million, I'm assuming this $1 million must be transformer.
Okay. So if the rate increases cover the issuance of a bond, that bond is then paid off over the life of the bond based on this model.
That's correct.
Okay. We haven't had a rate study or an infrastructure study and we don't
At
know
least
how long.
15 years.
How often?
1996.
Was the last one.
1996.
I believe it was 1996.
It seems like an unusually long time to go with the absence of, and if you don't study it, then you don't know what you're projecting. If you don't know what you're projecting, you don't know what to plan for reserves, and we find ourselves again, oops, okay.
Yeah, the
How
study-
often should
3
they
to 5
study?
years.
3 to 5.
Yeah.
So we're
And
way
that's
behind.
part of the reason why your customer charges so low.
Yeah, we haven't raised rates in over 15 years, and that has not allowed us to build up the capital and the reserves to do some of these larger scale projects without getting a bond.
And if it was brought up in 2006, what action was taken, if any?
Dan, do you remember that?
I just think that they just out of sight out. It just never, it's doing all right.
Let's kick the can down the road.
Yep.
We've been dumping a hand for the last couple of years.
Seems like this is deja vu all over again.
We have done stuff, to help it. definitely.
Oh, no doubt. But again, one of the examples is if you, you said, this whole model is built on assumptions. And the assumptions change. And if the assumption was that this is the area of growth, if we'd been doing studies every 35 years, you would have said, wait a minute, it's headed a different way. We would have been able to adapt. Or at least preserve
Most people out there
based on those changes.
don't fix it till it's broke.
That was kind of the attitude. It was that if it's not broke, why do we need it?
Well,
It's like a
because-
log-in.
Because it's predictably going to break.
Wasn't a crisis.
Well, the water system's a good example. The guy, former city managers kept kicking it down the road until we had a big fire downtown and I collapsed the entire system. Then all of a sudden we got a,
I think we need an ordinance against kicking it down the road.
so, now this is something we need to look at.
This is helpful. This is.
Well, it's necessary.
Yeah, it's needed, no doubt.
And right on the heels of the electric study will be then water and wastewater.
So not a surprise.
Same problem.
Okay, good. Let's
Now,
see
the,
concept.
I'm trying to remember your projections on growth. That's growth in demand,
It's system growth and sales.
system growth.
It was half.
Is it taking, is 0.5% reasonable given? What did you say, the average 400, 600 amp
400
services? Are
amps
you
is
kidding
one
me?
today, yeah.
Is that factored into those numbers? I don't want to go through this once and then find out that it's 0.75.
We didn't do a detail, 0.75 that can change much, but.
Well, or 3.
But yeah, if it's 3%.
We
then
need to know the real number.
That'd be a good thing, because that would bring the overall cost down. So when we go back in 40 years to look at it, we're gonna look better.
Well, as long as we have regular updates on this, then we'll begin to have it's hard to extrapolate with one data point.
We look more at historical rather than projecting forward.
Which, with a rapidly changing environment, has a real downside.
This is kind of taking into consideration that our residents have jumped considerably over the past couple of years.
If it was in the historical model, yes.
Well, with COVID,
If it's
our
recent.
residential situation around here has probably jumped a third.
I don't think the historic numbers would show it because it's all very recent. Depends on how far you go and how we're averaging it out. But again, I don't mean to beat it, but this is
Well,
the
that's a
right
good
first
point.
step.
But yeah, what we do is we actually went back in our model, I believe in this case, in 2019. So we skipped over the COVID year
Okay, so
to
that's-
try to
sure.
jump over COVID. That's what we do in most of our
But
models.
these need to be done regularly because electric cars is just one factor. When they encourage you to go out and buy electric, they don't talk about the demand on the infrastructure and the need to feed those chargers.
Well, what we're doing a lot of around the country, we're preparing for EVs, is that with EVs, there's three things you need to consider. A lot of utilities are installing their own chargers, public charging stations, so the rates for that. Then commercial establishments like gas stations, shopping malls, charging stations being installed, and these things like Tesla charging station, we do work for Nashville. They have Tesla has charging stations. They have 8 of them. Each of them have a capability of 250 kW. So that's like 2 megawatt load just in that one location. So we're looking at the growth and how to
Right.
do those connections. Then you have the residential, where you then, in order to, you want to give them a time use rate to try to incentivize, because charging it off hours. Because what happens with electricity is, historically, we've never had the ability to send or charge rates, real accurate rates. What I mean by that is when we do a cost of service that we look at averages, we do rates, we look at averages. So if we say the average rate for residential should be 12 cents a kilowatt hour, that's what the rate is. But the reality of it is that may be the average, but at night it may only be 6 cents, and during the middle of the day it might be 18. And so with time of use rates, we're able to take advantage of setting the price signal for charging at night. And but if they want to use it during the daytime, rather than the average 12. And that's where the industry is headed. to promote electric vehicles and send proper price signals. Again, fairness to customers.
And to motivate the behavior that you really want to have.
And you know, one of the things too, if I go back 25 years ago, I don't want to waste too much of your time with this, but I always thought that electricity pricing was called inelastic. And what that means is no matter what you charge, customers aren't going to change their usage. The reality of it is that isn't the case. You know, what we found is that people do respond. It's a lot more elastic than what we thought. And what happened with residential is there's two different types of price elasticity points, not to get into deep in economics here, but when I say elasticity, it's customers' response to the price signals. So there's two types. In other words, if we go to time of use rates with a higher rate than on peak, there's a short-term price elasticity where customers are not going to inconvenience themselves to take advantage. Some may shift. But what will happen is over time, they'll purchase the enabling devices, like setback thermostats, a good example, to shift their usage to different time periods. So we see that response around the country, customers responding to this, residential customers. And also residential customers understand time of use. Not that they understand it from an electric standpoint yet, but when you look at our environment, hotels, the pricing is, you know, higher on the weekends than during the week, or higher in the summer than during the winter. You know, matinees at theaters. I mean, it's not a concept that they're unfamiliar with. And you look at back in the 80s with long distance phone call, you know. It's, you know, it's a concept that I know that's weird. Well, back in the 80s, but anyway, it's a concept that they're familiar with, and that's where the industry is. Anyway, I know I've taken probably more time than I should have.
No,
Very informative.
no, this is necessary and very well presented.
So to summarize, then we will come back to council with the capital improvements plan. And then we'll, after council's approval of that, then we'll come back with final rate study presentation, and then council can approve the rates or suggest alternatives. But that's the path. We wanted to introduce you now because it is a lot
Oh, yeah.
to take in and process. And we are calling for future rate increases, so some of it we need to process before we. So
And the redo of the model will include flattening on the front end. I think that's the right thing to do. I'm not sure.
Yeah, stable.
Yeah, and of course, every year closer.
Very important. Thank you very much. Very interesting.
Thank you.
If nothing were to happen, like you said, a brownout or blackout would be 4th of July. Or thereabouts.
Of course.
Well, we get,
Absolutely.
what do we get, Dan? 2 or 3 brownouts a season right now
Yeah,
in certain areas?
at different times, yeah. Different circuit.
Would you entertain a,
Sure.
as an electric customer, this all, sounds reasonable. And I would generally be in favor of aligning rates with costs, on that customer charge. And I think it would be great not to subsidize seasonal residents. And I think the other, some other data that would be helpful to explaining to customers, whatever we do, is some benchmarking against the big 3 utilities in the state. DTE, Consumers and Great Lakes, what are their rate increases over the past 15 years? What are their projected rates, and what are their actual rates? How do we compare? Is that data available?
It is, it's available. We get to, some of it's more readily available than others, but we can probably incorporate it as part of the rate design.
Derive something that we could
To
explain.
show you what it is. I'm pretty much confident to say that you're probably less than all of
But that is,
What's
them.
less?
You're probably less. than
We are
rates.
probably right.
Yeah.
but from a validation standpoint and a competitive standpoint, that's really important information.
Oh, yeah. Great. Thank you, Mark.
Thank you.
Hope to be in touch.
Yeah.
Thanks a lot. Appreciate you coming.
They travels.
Okay. We're dizzy.
All right. Moving on to 3B, the reason why JB's in the audience.
Well, blessed us with his presence.
So the last Harbor Commission meeting, the Harbor Commission discussed a new course regarding the Harbor Master Building. And this new course is due to the fact that it's unlikely that our waterfront funds or general funds will have the money to be able to go with that initial proposed design for a new building at the green space. It wasn't just a new cost of the new building, which was exceeding $1 million, but also as well as the parking lot improvements, green space improvements, all that just added to at least $2 to $3 million project. Just guessing right here, but so realizing that the funds probably weren't there to do this in the next 5 years, the Harbor Commission discussed instead of erecting a new building, redesigning the current existing building for laundry facilities. And that was the real reason why they progressed with building a new building, was the idea of we didn't have laundry facilities in town for the boaters. So the idea was that the city would remodel the existing building, get rid of the bathrooms and replace those with laundry facilities. That the Marina Park, the green space, some sort of structure would be erected, which could be some sort of shade structure with some bathrooms attached to it, some restrooms attached to it, which would be the public bathrooms. And then the Marina Harbor Master Building would essentially just be the Harbor Master Building. There would be no need for the general public to access that. So there was a lot of advantages discussed at the Harbor Commission meeting why I would go down this route. One is lower costs. I mean, plain and simply, this would cost a lot less money. You're talking about a few $100,000, roughly for the Harbor Master upgrades, and less money for infrastructure improvements for a new building. So it would just cost less. It would also preserve the integrity of the current Marina Park green space layout. The proposed new building originally would have been where the green space is right now, and would divide the green space up into two halves. Now it preserves existing layout. As mentioned, the third big reason is that the drive for this was laundry facilities. Remodeling the existing Harbor Master Building would provide those laundry facilities for boaters. And finally, there was discussion, and it is true, and I think the police chief will back this up, though, that existing location of the bathrooms just causes a lot of congestion and unnecessary congestion risk, because the bathrooms are not by a sidewalk. Pedestrians cut through the parking lot to get to those restrooms, and there's a lot of circulation issues with that, congestion issues there. But of course, questions still remain. For example, we're not sure yet of the costs and extent of a remodel, the location of the proposed Marina Park structure, the type of Marina Park structure that we would have, and questions about whether or not we should redo the parking lot, which has been talked about at the same time as adding in a new structure, we're doing the Harbor Master Building. So those are all open questions that we have right now that are unanswered that we still have to further explore. So my recommendation after council discussion would be to ask staff to examine the feasibility, costs and potential designs for a remodel, as well as some sort of structure at Marina Park. Of course, that's the reason Marina Park Committee was set up, was to look at long-term use of Marina Park. So they would, of course, be tasked with coming with a recommendation to council for that. And of course, the Harbor Commission would be all in the game of how to remodel the Harbor Master Building. So JB is here from the Harbor Commission. If you have questions about more of the Harbor Commission's thoughts, but I know a couple of you were in attendance in that as well. So that is a proposal, that's a recommendation. And I think it's the one that staff can get behind because it does save costs and it does, it works for more people than the original proposed new building did.
Also, the time frame where it could happen is much, much, much shorter. We actually get to do something there.
So open it up, any discussion, thoughts, concerns?
I think it's the way to go. Because we've been kicking the can on this one for a few years also.
I thought it was a really good discussion at the time. There was a lot of, there were questions and answers discussion. I think the end result is a good plan. And looking at how we would do it is the next step.
The bathrooms, are they looking to go down by the pier on the westerly end of the
I
property?
think that's yet to be determined, John, but in brief talks, it would be in that northwest corner and probably some realignment of that traffic circle and the parking in that area. And that the parking stuff was actually a result of the planning we did for the new building that we elected not to build. One of the good things that came out of that is the architects there, I thought, had a very good traffic layout in there that kept almost all of the existing parking, but made it much more safe for pedestrians and opened up more space down.
That's true.
So I think we'd be looking toward that type of direction, but that's yet to be.
Now, the thing with the chamber,
Thank you. The gazebo.
the gazebo, would that
Figure
be,
it out. I'll figure it out. I'm putting $14,000 into that rehab right now. And I still need to add more money. So it's a huge.
Well, I think it's an opportunity to really integrate that type of stuff with what happens down there. And
Well, that's what I was
And I'm
wondering, if
not
that's
arguing, I'm
something,
not arguing against it.
if
I
that's
just
something that the,
need
that
to make
information-
sure that that structure doesn't get lost in the conversation.
I don't think it is lost. I think we're just exploring what ought to happen with that. And I think certainly in whatever happens with that structure down there, the opportunity to make sure that
I
that
think-
service to the public still happens exists.
I think
And we
that-
could probably improve it.
The chamber, it's gonna be a discussion of the gazebo. I think it's probably adamant that it should stay there. It's been there. It's actually provides a good vital service for people coming to town, downtown area. So, but what it's gonna look like, I mean, that's gonna be a result of Marina Park Committee discussions, I guess. If, depends on the location of the structure. If the structure's on the northwestern end, if we redo that parking lot, all of that needs to be examined. Whether that, I mean, Bonnie, you're gonna be integral to those conversations of whether that building can be moved slightly or relocated on the property itself. I mean, I know you're putting money into it, so we need to have that discussion. Marina Park did.
well, that's what I was gonna get at. I don't know if it, with the design of the building, if it's something that could actually incorporate
Right.
what the chamber's been trying to do
Can you
before you
build
start
me an
wasting.
office too? Oh, wait, is that not part of this conversation?
$14,000.
Well, no kidding, I understand.
But you know, I don't know,
Jim.
obviously ran into this issue with Fort Park, about having the
Something to
chamber
consider.
into a,
A city building.
That's what we
Building.
talked about when Bonnie, Lucas and I sat down. It's not about whether the information booth stays or goes, it's just whether it's incorporated into the new building. Or if we put the new building somewhere else and it's all placed.
right. So we hold off dumping a bunch of money
Yeah.
into it. If you haven't already, some of the rehab things.
Well, the second half of it wouldn't have been until the end of next summer, and so we'll know a whole lot more.
So-
But it had to have something done.
Oh, absolutely.
I know, you've seen it.
But now that we've actually looking at a footprint for the next year or two or whatnot, I mean, that's something to definitely keep in the mix. So we're not wasting money
Thank you.
there. Anyway,
Emma, am I understanding, you guys are still talking about a new structure versus a remodel?
No, we're talking about two different.
two different buildings, remodel of the existing structure, and then there would be a separate bathroom facility.
Are we anticipating on the remodel that the footprint's gonna stay the same? Pretty much anyway?
Yes.
Am I
That's
right?
where I would start.
That's what I
that,
was
Nancy.
assuming, and
And
that's
by remodel, I think we're looking primarily at the existing public bathrooms turning into the laundry
so
facility.
not any substantial change in the.
It's more of an interior thing
footprint.
than an exterior,
That's what I, okay, that's what I thought.
Yeah.
Okay,
taking the guts out of it and redoing it.
I think it's a good plan.
and I think the Marina Park structure is, something needs to happen because we need to have public bathrooms, but that's about all we've really, when I was in that meeting, and that's really about all that has been talked about. It's not
Right,
what type of structure, exactly where, any of that at this point.
to be determined. Yeah,
Right.
yeah.
That's
And that's what kind of
activity.
structure is gonna go there.
Yeah, and where it's gonna be and how we're gonna incorporate it. Just knowing we need public bathrooms.
And then that leads me to the next question, which happens first? Do new bathrooms happen first before it gets?
Well, I would, logistically, I
what?
would have to say that the new bathrooms with new structure would have to go first before you take away the harbor
Without-
master bathroom.
Alright, Just
Because you need.
putting it out there.
Yeah.
Thank you.
That's a good question, Bonnie.
Yeah.
Or we'll put
I was
No, I'm just-
Porta
potties.
potties, which would be one.
Doesn't porta potties in
Marina
those
Park
4 parking
Committee
spots?
Probably won't go.
Guys, they
I'm
come
all
in
for
green,
that.
it'll be fine.
Permanent basis.
Okay, we're down the rabbit hole.
All right, yeah.
Any other questions about that?
Victor, I would like to ask
Yeah.
if I could have a current list of who's on the Marina Park Committee. Because
Yeah.
there's been a lot of juggling on that committee, so I
We have
actually
had a
don't know.
couple people leave.
Yeah, I don't even know who's still on that committee, so before they start looking, that would be good. Thank you.
Attendance at those meetings is gonna go up, I think.
Yeah,
Should.
hope so. Who's on it with you, Scott?
Well, Rachel is now,
Right.
the lead on it.
Scott, Bonnie, Margot, Sharon, Deanna, and Jeff.
Jeff
Yeah,
James.
and Jeff.
So possibly, Victor, I can't remember exactly what we voted in terms of numbers on that at this point, but kind of a refresher on that and attendance, who's been at the meetings and who hasn't been at
I
the
know the
meetings.
two people that we lost were residents, non-board members.
Right.
So
Right,
probably.
and the attendance at them, because I think that's important too, who's been showing up.
Well, whoever's been doing what, they've done a great job this year.
Yes,
so.
it was great this summer.
Big impact.
It was great this summer. It was super.
Generally speaking, the core that's still there attends all the meetings. And that's a general statement. Those who dropped off because they
Couldn't be
they
there.
couldn't show up, yeah.
Do you have what you need?
Yeah, no, this is,
Thanks.
we'll get going.
Yeah. Good plan.
So what's then the next step?
So the next step is, we're gonna probably go to the Marina Park Committee to start discussing about types of structures and location. I would imagine that'd be the next step. The Marina Park Committee to bring some recommendations to council, probably take a few months, and then figure out the costs from staff's point of A, that structure, and B, a remodel, what type of remodel. That's gonna involve more discussion at the Harbor Commission, but
Do
we
you guys
wanna-
have a plan already, JB?
No,
No. Concept. We have a can, we're trying not to kick it.
From one person
No,
to the
Victor,
next.
I don't think that our Harbor Commission representative Jeff James has been able to make very many of those meetings. And I'd be happy to go if the committee wanted some input, but there ought to be pretty good integration between those two boards because they're really both in the same boat, so to speak.
okay, yeah. Come back to
So maybe
council with
if you
that.
could let me know, or if I can't make it, or Jeff can't, then we'll make sure somebody from the commission.
So yeah, if you remember, we appointed, we had the chairs of those boards.
Yeah, if there's room, I'll get on that board.
I think it counts.
Yeah, we'll talk, we'll bring at the next council meeting about
I agree.
relooking at the structure of the Marina Park Committee.
One thing for the temporary one summer, but now we're talking about much more permanent stuff
And significant project.
and costs. So,
Regardless, I'll look again on that. So,
And also, as a caveat, what we do at the Marina Park, with regards to the structure, will depend on the funds that we have available. I mean, so that's, we're being optimistic here that we could do something next year, the year after, but
Right.
it all depends on the funding, type of project we're doing. So. Okay, so moving on to short-term rentals. So the Planning Commission reviewed and discussed recommendations from a Planning Commission subcommittee group, kind of spearheaded by Bill Mulder, and Andy Bowman was on that, Emily DeBay, and Beth Rahali until she left the Planning Commission. So there was a subcommittee that held a public input session. As we know, there's well over 70 people between Zoom and in person at that short-term rental meeting. We looked at a lot of different municipalities, short-term rental ordinances and what they do for short-term rentals. And we just looked at a lot of the data we have here and what are the issues. So we kind of broke it down into two different things. The subcommittee had two different recommendations. There's recommendations for enforcement and behavioral issues. And then there was recommendations related to future land use character of the area. Furthermore, that was broken down into things that could be implemented, sooner rather than later, and that probably didn't need as much discussion or wouldn't be as controversial as well. Then there is the whole, longer discussion items such as, do we set limits on short-term rentals? What do those numbers look like? What districts are those? And you do an overlay district. Do we have a whole revamp of our code, and our city code versus zoning code? Because right now it's in this city code, but do we put it in the zoning code? So those require a lot more lengthy discussions that you can't solve right now. So the Planning Commission presented some ideas that they felt, within the next 2, 3, maybe 4 months, by early winter, we could have these done with. So one was streamlining the short-term rental enforcement process. And that is just as much to do with the ordinance as well as to do with staff, because we follow the same warning system that we do for other zoning violations, usually a letter followed up by another letter until we actually say, all right, you're in violation. We try to bring them into compliance before we issue them a ticket. So maybe it's just something for short-term rentals. It's one letter, fix this by this date, and that's it. We don't propose doing that for every single, like our typical zoning process, because we still rather bring people in compliance. But for short-term rental issues, they're usually things that need to be addressed right then and there. It's not like a, your tall grass that, you have a couple weeks to cut it. This is, there's a behavior issue, we got to address it. So one thing we can do with that is a step from a staff perspective, enforcement perspective. Then there's an ordinance thing. Do we want to continue with the whole suspension process where, you get one suspension could be, you have to have a hearing, which is, 30 days, you have 30 days to notice it or whatnot for the person. And then there's another suspension hearing if you violate again. So it's a cumbersome process. Maybe we just need to relook at our hearing process or penalty process with the attorney and just see if there's a way to make that more efficient. Those are just some examples. Yep.
On that, with the enforcement part of it, I think a phone call needs to be made versus, maybe send a letter out so you get a paper trail.
Oh, yeah.
I think a call.
Mhm.
The actual, that way it speeds up the process. So we don't run into this monthly meeting where we got people in here going over the same shit day after day after day.
And fast enforcement is
Yeah.
I believe
Well,
the,
Because you're gonna know on a phone call whether they're gonna be compliant or not. So
And
let's
there's
get
two
this
kinds.
figured out in the first week or so, and then if
Well, that's what.
Kyle's gotta get involved or what we gotta do.
There's two kinds, because usually we get complaints that go straight to the police, and those are usually dealt with right away. But then we get complaints that might not be necessarily nuisances, that just might be, there might be a parking issue, there might be something related that already had happened. So if you call the person, there's, you want to kind of, the issue's already done with, that people have left. So you want to kind of have something on record saying, this is the violation.
I agree.
So there's two different kinds of responses. So, but yeah, I get what you're saying, a more speedier response. And usually theoretically having the local agent on file should be able to help with that.
Well, and I think that's something we need to look at and make sure that we have that.
in my mind.
But obviously with the new program you got in place, we should be kind of caught up by now with who, what, where, and when.
The local agent needs to know we're on top of this. They need to get the call. They need to know it's urgent. They need to deal with it because you're right. You have turnover. By the nature of a short-term rental, that local agent needs to be on the ball. And I think a lot of these problems are going to go away.
Isn't there a time frame that we have to be able to get a hold of them and then they have to respond in the ordinance?
I'm not sure exactly what it is, but
There is a
there's
very short time frame that they are supposed to get back. Yeah.
This
So-
is
Well, the
supposed to be-
unfortunate thing, the only way people are gonna learn is if we make an example out of them.
I was gonna say, we need to hold them to it.
We're gonna have
If
to
it's
hold some people
24 hours,
accountable and
it's
then
24
go
hours.
from there.
Well, I think it's also good to keep in mind that we've only really had one or two experience with one or two properties. So this is just, based off one or two properties, our enforcement experience. It's not based off
True.
general trend or anything. So
But
keep
I
that
think
in
we've
mind.
learned that delays in the feedback loop are what have really let it go too long. So I think that's the right path to go.
These kind of options, the next three ones go together hand in hand. One is developing a good neighbor campaign. That would be for the people who are renting these Airbnbs or these short-term rentals, kind of some sort of, brochure, some sort of handout, some sort of, informational packet that lets them know how to be respectful and how to be a good member of the neighborhood, the community. Same thing with the develop a good host campaign. These are taken from other larger municipalities that have similar campaigns that seem to work well in those communities. Going along with that, develop a handout that is required to be handed out to renters. Right now, we have basically require the short-term rental, the landlord essentially to hand out just to give them a packet of the ordinances. But, do people actually sit there and read through, ordinances? No. So maybe we've developed a brochure or a handout that City Harbor Springs approved that requires each tenant to have that, and the landlord has to hand it to each tenant, which lays out the expectations for the renters in the neighborhood. Another thing is to review the nuisance ordinances to see if updates are necessary. This is, doesn't mean we need to update the nuisance ordinances, but just staff can look at it to see, do these nuisance ordinances still make sense? Whether it's noise, whether it's smoke from the fire pits, whatever it is, do these ordinances, are they still good? Then review definitions of motel, hotel, inn, and bed and breakfast, and update if necessary. And, I'm particularly looking at the definitions of inn and bed and breakfast. And because those are really most closely aligned with what a short-term rental does. And do we need to relook at those in general, regardless of short-term rentals? It might be a good time to do that right now. And then finally, if we implement any of these things, such as a good neighbor campaign, adding more streamline this enforcement process to put more resources to it, we should require, look at a 2022 increase fee cost for the short-term rental application, because all of this will take more resources and more time to implement. And so that is the recommendation to go forward now. However, there is a caveat here, and that is that the House approved a short-term rental bill that limits the ability of a municipality to cap short-term rentals at 30%. That means we cannot, we cannot have a number that's lower than that. So we have to have at least 30% of our housing stock is allowed to be short-term rentals. And that for us would be, we're looking at over 350 houses about. Right now we're at, as you see, 57 licensed. That's the Harmari, who we group a contract with. They say that's about 75 to 85%, target accuracy rate. So we're probably in the neighborhood about 70 anyway, 70 to 75. So that would be quadrupling, or 5 times the amount of short-term rentals would be allowed that we currently have. And it doesn't allow, the bill doesn't allow municipalities to limit them per district. So it has to be 30% of the whole city. We can't say a commercial district can have more, residential R1A can have less. Finally, that short-term rental bill also states that it's a by right use of a property. It's not a commercial use. So that has some strong implications. It does limit the number that an owner, an individual can rent out to 2, but there's obviously a lot of ways around that by creating different LLCs and different companies. So we're not sure exactly how that would work. So, I mean, there's no, I guess hope is not lost yet. I mean, they have, the Senate has till, I believe, December 15th to ratify or pass a version of the bill, and they could modify that bill as well. And then
How come I can't hear it? Nope, it's all muted.
Jeff, can you hear me?
I can now. It's all muted. And not now. Oh, well.
Randy said you should be able to talk now.
That's all well and wonderful, but the microphone for the city of Harbor Springs is off.
No, we have two mic systems. I'm trying to delay a double echo. So you can speak, Jeff or Miranda.
I hope they read my question. I hope we got my question.
Particular, it's a huge help, just to give us some focus to what we're trying to talk about. So I appreciate it. And I think it's great to go ahead with that. Let staff explore those things.
Yeah, I mean, really can't do a whole lot until we know what the state's gonna do.
Or just, we are keeping track of all of our calls that we're getting. And it was interesting last night, I walked for 3 hours for Halloween. I know it's a special night, but there are multiple fires that if it would have been in the summer, we would have probably received complaints for short-term rentals having the same fires. And so it's just interesting last night when I walked around and see what's happening. You know, it's the same, I'll leave it at that. But we keep track of every short-term rental that we get from Bechtel.
You're saying fires like physical outdoor fires?
Correct. We received complaints from the one we had summer multiple times about that one having an outdoor fire.
Are you able to give that report and submit it to the city so it can be like displayed in the notes and then?
No, we keep track of them internally and I'll give a report if requested.
Okay.
It's historically for Halloween and different things, we've been pretty lenient on.
Oh, yeah, without a doubt.
Things.
There's no issues. There was no complaints last night.
Right.
There's no issues.
Yeah.
I think it's a good thing.
Yeah.
So then, if I may speak again, so I'm hearing things I hadn't heard before. We have a 2-bedroom, 2-bath property we rent. We have an on-site person meet our guests when they come in and out the entire time. We have eyes, lots of eyes in the neighborhood on the property. We've never had a situation where people were bringing in blow-up mattresses or going over. I have them sign a contract, there's fees that go against that. So maybe there's some additional internal work that the property owners should be doing that would stop that from occurring. I haven't had that as a situation at all.
I think that's where this good neighbor, good host program will be helpful.
Yeah.
And we have 10 on our.
Because your studio versus some of the other things that's going on around here is a little different.
I'm sorry, could you say it again?
Your studio apartment or whatever that you have is a little different than what's,
So we have a 2-bedroom, 2-bath home.
oh,
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah, and it's a
cool.
2-bedroom, 2-bath, and we allow 4 people. And I actually collect the names of all 4 people, the addresses of all 4 people, and they sign a contract. So that if they do violate that, there's fees that they'll be charged. So I do a lot of internal work. So a lot of things that you guys are talking about that might affect properties that are operating negatively might bring them into compliance. However, I'm concerned with any changes that you do that are gonna compound, fees to me that I am doing everything and complying fully.
no, I think what we're trying to do is get on board with what you're already doing.
Well, if I can assist with that at all, I'd be glad. I don't throw my hat in the ring, yeah.
I think that's the whole idea behind it.
Yeah, we have 8 rentals on our street and we really don't have any complaints at all.
So then staff will go forward with,
I think you should go forward with whatever you think you can go forward with without,
All of that, or not all that.
well, the next.
whatever you're
next couple
comfortable going
months,
forward with until we know what the state's gonna throw at us.
We are at budgeting season, so we won't be able to get everything done in the next, but we'll be able to tackle some of these and, as we'll go back to the planning commission later on for some review. But we'll come back to what we can to council probably in December or January. Hopefully to get some things in place for next year's rental season. Thanks, Bill.
Yeah,
Thank
good
you.
job.
Thanks.
So before we go to closed session, Mayor, just go to the city manager report and then we can go to closed session. That's fine. I don't think we have any boards and commissions right now, other than we still have December is when we're looking to do appointments for all of those boards and commissions. So very quick, we have a holiday tree, Christmas tree. The lighting is going to take place on Saturday, November 27th at 6 p.m. It was donated by Corrine Sevraes. I'm not sure how to pronounce her last name, but she lives over in Levering. So it's a little bit further out, but it was a good tree. We had a few trees in town that just weren't big enough for the right kind of tree. The city hosted a trunk or treat event for kids on Saturday. Rachel and Nate had a big part in helping with that. It was a fun event. I wasn't there, but it's like, what, 150 kids? People
Yeah,
there?
it's about 150 people. I got there at like 3:30, couldn't find a parking spot. It was really popular.
Last week, Friday or Thursday, Nick showed me the first half of the $126,000 payment we got from the American Rescue Act. That money is, we can use for certain things. It's a broad range of things we can use to spend on it, but we have to very carefully look at how we can spend that money. So we'll probably be coming to council when we do the CIP planning with just some suggestions of where that money can best be utilized. It doesn't need to be spent automatically. I think we have 5 or 6 years to spend it, but we have 3 or 4 years. We'll get the right dates, but we have to commit at least the next couple of years on where to spend it. So, and it'll be in a separate account held there, so we don't intermix it with other monies. The school Halloween parade was on Friday at 1 p.m. That was fun. I had fun. I didn't partake in it, but I still had fun.
Okay.
Yeah.
For the event, it was funded by the Mary Claire Reynolds Joyce Fund. So the money was granted, so.
Yeah.
Nice.
So getting grant money when we can. Boards and commissions, the planning commission has met. They reviewed a site plan and special land use request, as you can tell, also the STR recommendations. As typical, a few MPPA meetings, CCE 911 meeting. You guys, mayor, council appointed me that as a representative now that Petoskey has no city manager. They have an acting city manager. He was the former rep. So now I'm the rep and they'll be the acting rep. And that's all I have. Jim, if you want to give the mayor some, let's wait, new or old business first.
All right, your old business.
Thanks.
Oh, good. Verbiage, please.
Yes, sir. We would need a motion from a council person that the city council meeting closed session under section 8E of the Open Meetings Act, specifically under section 8E, to consult with the city attorney regarding trial and settlement strategy in connection with the pending case involving Shea Park and the Demmer property, on the ground that an open meeting would have a detrimental effect on the litigating or settlement strategy of the city.
I'll make the motion.
I'll second it.
Ben Leo,
Yes.
Nancy Rondell.
Yes.
John Cops.
Yes.
Matt Bugera.
Yes.
Motion carried. We are in closed session.
Yeah, I'm coming.
Thank you.
Thank you.